Good morning, everyone. This is Robert, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 26th of February, 2026. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started with Inside the Beltway. According to officials, the Trump administration is expanding information sharing between intelligence agencies and federal law enforcement agencies. And they said the Trump administration is still considering how to share a database. It's called the Compass database, which includes 770 million records. And it was previously maintained by what used to be the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force that has been supplanted by the Homeland Security Task Forces. I think part of this is in part a preemptive move for expanding the targeting of foreign terrorist organizations, especially those that have been designated by the Trump administration recently that could include U.S. citizens. And that's probably what's stopping or what is has the Trump administration considering their options with sharing this database between agencies like the CIA and the FBI and DEA, because there is some complexity here due to some of these cartels and other gangs that have been designated foreign terrorist organizations like MS-13 having members that are U.S. citizens. I also think there's a possibility if the Trump administration further expands intelligence agency access to this Compass database, that is also potentially a preemptive move for the Trump administration going after, especially internationally, Antifa groups. Over in the Capitol building, Senator Ted Budd, North Carolina Republican, and Representative Mary Miller, an Illinois Republican, introduced the Stop Illegal Alien Cops Act in the House and Senate yesterday. This bill would eliminate the federal exception that allows illegal aliens with a protected status and work permit who are hired as police officers from being issued firearms. This is something that's become more common since the beginning of the Biden era in 2021, where more local police departments started looking at aliens who had work permits and some type of protected status, like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, to make up shortfalls of police hiring. In federal law, there is a what is effectively a loophole in the prohibition of illegal aliens possessing firearms unless they are issued during the course of police duties. In this case, they're trying to close that loophole. And then finally, inside the Beltway, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts asked Congress to pass a bill giving the federal courts authority to manage their own courthouses. They said that the General Services Administration has mismanaged courthouses for decades, and this is leaving federal courthouses in crisis because they're having critical system failures, repairs are being underfunded, and they're seeing increasing security risks, especially as security systems start to fail. Moving over to the domestic side, Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows said that the Department of Homeland Security told Democrat secretaries of state that ICE agents will not be deployed outside of voting locations during the 2026 election. She said DHS officials would not agree, however, to tell the public that states are in charge of elections. And she said she did not feel assured that the Trump administration would not try to interfere in state sovereignty over the 2026 election. I think, of course, the Trump administration is going to tell Democrats they aren't going to send ICE to polling stations during the election. I think it's important to point out, or it's important that Bellows pointed out that they are not conceding to the two state Democrats that state-run elections seemed important enough, or that they are not going to interfere in state-level elections. I think it's key that they found it important to point that out because we have seen over the last couple of months Trump talk about how the Republicans need to nationalize elections, and there's been some vagueness over exactly what he meant, and people have been trying to read the tea leaves on that. I think it's possible that Trump is dipping his toe into the Rubicon in a manner of speaking instead of crossing it. And I think that this is one of those instances like Mike and I talked about last year, where if Trump gets up to the point of crossing the Rubicon, in the previous case, it was invoking the Insurrection Act. In this case, I think it is asserting some federal authority over elections. If you only go halfway, that's worse than not going at all. And I think in this case, the Trump administration is kind of dipping their toe in the Rubicon on elections, and that has a potential for a massive backlash, I think. All right, moving over to New York. The NYPD said that vandals slashed the tires on 7 NYPD strategic response group vehicles parked outside of their headquarters in Brooklyn. They said they didn't have a description of the vandals and that no arrests have been made so far. I've also not seen a far left report back. That these are the anonymous report backs that are usually posted on far left blogs, because there are multiple of these far left blog aggregators, and they will take groups like Crime Think. They will take reports from far left affinity groups. They will anonymize them for operational security and information security purposes, and then post them so that there are groups that are taking credit for these vandalisms, these what they call direct actions. I've not seen one yet, but this happened on Monday, so it's possible there will be one coming in the next week or two. And this does fit previous direct actions, where far left groups have targeted police vehicles, and the NYPD Special Response Group is also a priority target for the far left. I think this is one of the groups that now Mayor Zohran Mamdani highlighted as one of the NYPD units that he planned to disband. Over in Maine, Maine anti-ICE activists filed a lawsuit against DHS on Monday, and they're alleging that ICE collected their personal data and then used that data to harass and threaten activists and protesters. They said the ICE agents followed the activists home and threatened them with physical violence. I think the threats of physical violence are likely not accurate, or at least not at scale. But the DHS is very likely building an anti-ICE activist database, and there's been publicly a couple of incidents where ICE agents have been recorded by activists saying that they're putting them in a database. Tom Homan, the border czar, has talked about pushing DHS to build this database. And there have also been some contracting documents published by DHS and ICE where they are looking for contractors to manage these databases. So I think that is very likely accurate. And then why is the anti-ICE organized resistance is pushing back on this? Because they do rely in part on anonymity to conduct their operations, especially the far left groups, affinity groups, and individuals that are involved in the organized resistance. And this is an attempt to put a stop to what is likely, in their view, going to be an effective tool for investigating and arresting the organized resistance. The Trump administration filed its own lawsuit this week, urging the New Jersey Federal District Court to block New Jersey Governor Mickey Sherrill's Executive Order 12. And this is an order that she issued on the 11th of February, and it blocks ICE agents from using state-owned properties or staging operations on state-owned properties. I think in this case, the Trump administration, like some previous fights in the courts, is looking for a court win here to set a precedent for other state and local bans on ICE and Customs and Border Protection operating on state property, with the idea that they can get a court decision here, even if it does end up going to the Supreme Court, that will allow them to say that due to the federal supremacy clause, ICE and CBP can operate and stage immigration enforcement operations on state property, regardless of what local and state governments say about it. Also in the courts, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the IRS can share taxpayer information with the Department of Homeland Security, and that U.S. law allows IRS to share this address information with DHS without a court order. And then finally, the Department of Health and Human Services said it's going to defer $259.5 million in quarterly Medicaid funding to Minnesota to prevent payments of any questionable claims while their fraud investigation continues. They also issued a nationwide call for Americans to support fraud prevention through what they're calling the Comprehensive Regulations to Undercover Suspicious Healthcare, or CRUSH initiative. CMS, that's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Administrator, Dr. Oz, said that they are now taking a proactive rather than reactive stance to catch fraud. And this is really kind of the first shot across the bow for Vice President J.D. Vance's new fraud mission that he was given by President Trump during the State of the Union. Due to the nature of the investigations and federal prosecutions and how time intensive they are, it's likely that the Trump administration's fraud probe is going to remain in Minnesota over the long term. So this is I think likely to be possibly running until the end of the administration. Additionally, I think part of this is also putting political pressure on Minnesota officials by targeting these fraud networks that frankly likely have some assistance from activists, nonprofits, and potentially some local and state officials in Minnesota. All right, Jared, if you could come on and take us through the global SITREP, please.
Yes, we're going to start off in Cuba. There was some big news just off the coast of Cuba yesterday. The Cuban Interior Ministry reported it killed 4 armed men in a Florida-registered speedboat within 1 nautical mile of the Cuban shores. Cuba claims that the men on the boat initiated the firefight that was had between them, and that they arrested 6 men in addition to the 4 that were killed. They're also saying that the men came prepared to carry out infiltration for terrorist purposes. That was due to the equipment that they had with them, including homemade IEDs. Now, Secretary of State Rubio was asked about this during a quick press conference, and he said that the Coast Guard's always in contact with their Cuban counterparts just due to proximity, and they're going to be conducting their own investigation as well. Speaking on Rubio, he is still down with the Caribbean heads of state down in the Caribbean there, and he tied U.S. security to the Caribbean directly. He said that he told the heads of state there that the stronger, the safer, and the more prosperous and the more secure all of your countries are, the Caribbean, the stronger, safer, more secure, and more prosperous the U.S. is going to be. Rubio promised actions in the Caribbean to follow up on the U.S.'s words and demonstrate its priorities, which will match the national security strategy. Now, what's happening here? The safer, stronger, more prosperous. That was the mission set out by the State Department under the new Trump administration. That was one of the first things we covered. It is actually, quantifiable there. Now, while all of the individual pieces of information here are not new, putting them all together in the same time, along with the Secretary of State explicitly telling these heads of state, we are prioritizing you. This region is core to U.S. security. That is new, and when taken in combination with recent U.S. actions, looking at the oil embargo on Cuba, some of the diplomatic actions taken against Nicaragua, the Venezuelan operation, what is being conveyed here is, even if you, the heads of state, have not read our national security strategy, here it is. We are telling you, work with us or face similar challenges to Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The U.S. also took several more diplomatic actions against Iran. This is to target their ballistic missile development, weapons procurement, and the shadow fleet of oil tankers. They sanctioned and designated numerous individuals and people and ships along all those. Now, this is in the midst of the talks that are ongoing today in Geneva between the U.S. and Iran. As soon as there is information published, I will get that out. Anybody who's over on the beta site will get to see it first. And lastly, on Tuesday, the U.S. arrested former U.S. Air Force Major Gerald Brown. He used to be an F-35 pilot and instructor, and he was arrested for conspiring to provide defense services to Chinese military pilots without authorization. He was training them on how to fight like an American, and that also means, conversely, how to beat the American Air Force.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the show. This is not a new person being arrested for this. This guy had begun training PLA Air Force pilots in 2023. I think originally this cropped up during the Biden administration. He was only arrested because he came back into the country this month. So yeah, I think this is the same guy that has been talked about for the last couple of years training PLA pilots. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the Homeland Operations update. We do have an update today. According to reporting, some more of the sales of DHS mega detention center warehouses have been canceled. The most recent sales cancellations were in Mississippi, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New York. It's not clear if DHS has plans yet for alternative sites for these warehouses. They have started the contract process. Here, what they're looking for is award contracts for managing these detention centers. And according to people who are familiar with what's going on with the contracts, right now, the 3 companies that are really in the running for these management contracts are Disaster Management Group, Momentum, and a company called SK2. Amentum is actually the contractor who is running the Boeing 737 fleet contract for DHS that started last year. There are 7 warehouses that have been successfully purchased in 5 states. That includes multiple, 2 in Texas, 2 in Pennsylvania, and then a warehouse in Maryland, 1 in Georgia, and 1 in Arizona. There's still 7 potential locations that are still under some step of sales, whether it's negotiation or closing. We had a question yesterday about why doesn't the Trump administration use eminent domain? Well, one of the owners of one of those Texas warehouses that did sell to the DHS said that they felt they were threatened they were basically being threatened with eminent domain if they did not follow through on the sale. So there is apparently behind the scenes some pressure on some of these warehouse owners to sell, with the Trump administration saying that they would if they don't sell, they could use eminent domain to take those warehouses. I think they're not doing that at first, or as their first step, because that is a lengthy legal process. I think it's likely we'll also see for these remaining 7 locations more attempts, if they're not already happening, to disrupt these sales, because we've seen with the canceled warehouse sales, there's been a combination of local governments and activists trying to put pressure on the owners of the warehouses not to sell, whether it's local city councils trying to pass bans on non-municipal detention centers, or activists holding protests, or in the case of one, trying to light the warehouse on fire. So I expect to see more of that. And this is, I think, also likely part of this larger idea from the anti-ICE, especially the far left parts of the anti-ICE organized resistance, to identify these strategic choke points. That is one likely risk with the Trump administration foregoing the 200 plus private prisons that are part of the detainee management process, and shrinking that down to a planned 34 sites. Is that now with fewer sites, with fewer government owned sites, you now have more locations that are, or fewer locations that are more susceptible to this type of disruption. Because in last year, during Operation Midway Blitz, some of the far left groups involved in the anti-ICE activity in Chicago, they explicitly said what they were trying to do was target strategic choke points for detainee operations by identifying these regional processing centers and detention sites where they could conduct direct action demonstrations and disruptive actions and get the most bang for their buck. They get the most disruption for the least amount of resources expended. And I think this is one of the risks that comes with the Trump administration moving to this mega detention center plan, is now with fewer sites, especially some of the larger sites, they are opening up detention centers to more of this type of disruption. All right, let's move on to questions and answers today. If you could pull up our first question, please, Jared. From Frozen Nomad: should Iran's government fall and Iran be divided and destabilized for the foreseeable future, what do you see as the biggest changes the world would experience as a result? Well, I think, Jared, if you want to go first.
Sorry, let me reread the question real quick. This is the only question we've gotten today, and I was searching for other ones. So I think the biggest thing there is that Iran sits at a multi-continental crossroad. The entire Middle East is that, but it's kind of the access point for Eastern Asia to get into the Middle East. They also control an enormous portion of the Persian Gulf. It's about, I think, half their coastline. Half of the Persian Gulf's coastline is controlled by Iran, along with the access to it via the Gulf of Oman. Just having Iran destabilized would severely hinder oil production, obviously. That's a huge amount of shipping as well. And I think it would also have reverberating effects into the rest of the Middle East, probably also into Pakistan and India as well, just because there is I believe it's Baluchistani Liberation Front down in their southeast along the border with Pakistan. It would, frankly, it would be messy beyond description. there's no real good way to put it. It would take hours to even dive into what a destabilized and fractured Iran looks like.
I think the first, if we see a fall of the Iranian regime, there's two things happening. One, I think a lot of their proxies are going to suddenly feel like they're going to suddenly lose their backing. Like Hezbollah has already been kind of on the back foot in Lebanese politics. Uh, just so in Lebanon, there's basically three factions that all control different parts of the government because of an agreement. There's the Christian Lebanese, the Sunni, and the Shia. And the Shia, Hezbollah is kind of part of the Shia faction. And there's been moves recently in Lebanon where the other two factions have been making moves against Hezbollah, disarming them. And I think that would accelerate in some of these areas, like as Iran's proxies start to lose their backing. However, on the other hand, I think we're gonna have a lot of, especially Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Codes Force guys, their equivalent of U.S. Army Special Forces and CIA, suddenly be looking for work and spreading across the region, and that could mean more destabilization and regionally. All right, let's move on to. I do see a couple of questions that didn't get a queue. All right, so Thomas Jefferson, who do you think the men on the boat headed to Cuba could have been? What is the likelihood Cuba is lying?
So first off, all the information that we've got out of it right now is coming from the Cuban government, which when it happens within a mile of the coast, that kind of makes sense. That said, all of that they did release 10. They released these four dead names and then one other captured name, and they were all Spanish names. And Cuba said not that they were U.S. citizens, which would be very, very beneficial to Cuba on the world stage to say, hey, yeah, the U.S. sent citizens to attack us. They said they were Cuban expats, meaning they are Cuban citizens that don't carry a U.S. passport. That that to me says that Cuba's probably not lying there. Just it wouldn't benefit them to lie about it in that way. Um, it frankly, I don't think this is going to go too. As long as Cuba's telling the truth, I don't think this has legs. This to me looks like it was something you've seen. If you really looked into Latin American history, it's actually not that uncommon to have a group of expats from a nation leave, go train somewhere else, and then come back and try to run a revolution. That happened in Venezuela, actually. I think that was one of the ones we covered when all of that was building up. Yeah, I don't think they're lying off the bat, but we'll have to wait to see what the U.S. finds in its investigation.
All right, I see a comment from Bad Wabbit. I think this is in relation to the Stop Illegal Alien Cops Act. Is that in their state they issue them per shift? I'm assuming this means firearms, and this is one of the things that a couple. It's not just your state. There's Illinois, Los Angeles, Colorado that have looked at hiring illegal aliens to make up for policing shortfalls, especially in these major cities like Los Angeles and Denver. One of the problems they had that they identified during the Biden administration was that if illegal aliens are prohibited from possessing firearms, including even if they're hired as police and they have a federal work permit, so they have some kind of protected status, that they would have to build the infrastructure to effectively issue firearms when they go on duty and then take them back in when they come off duty. And the ATF issued an opinion in 2023 about this, basically saying that as long as they are credentialed law enforcement officers with a federal work permit, they can possess firearms even off duty. And this part of this lawsuit in the Seventh Circuit, there was an illegal alien. We covered it a couple years ago. They filed a lawsuit saying illegal aliens should have Second Amendment protections. I think part of the goal of that lawsuit was to ease the way for more police departments to start hiring illegal aliens because then they could have firearms off duty because that was the major obstacle. Now, I did see another comment of like, oh, that asking like illegal aliens can become cops. Yes, unfortunately, that is a quirk of federal law. Yeah, how are non citizens allowed to be cops? Well, that's part of the federal law that if they have a work permit and they have some type of protected status, so like DACA, or they have a visa, they can become cops. And that's actually some of the cases where ICE has detained corrections officers or police in Maine or Illinois that are turned out to be illegal aliens, or were visa overstays because they were hired. And there's not a lot of these police departments and employers aren't really incentivized to look any further than, do you have the correct documents? Like that's one of the things about the E-Verify system. Technically, there is a process in place for employers to check the immigration status of potential or prospective employees. But they want, if they have documents that they present to them that say they're a citizen or a legal immigrant, and they put it in E-Verify, as long as the documents have the right names on them, or they otherwise are not explicitly illegal aliens, that as far as the employer can know, there's nothing stopping them from being hired. And this is not really something the administration can step in and fix. This is a problem that Congress has to fix by amending the law that covers E-Verify. Because if they do, for example, a lot of people ask why there aren't more worksite raids. Well, there are in certain states. There's more. I think there's a lot of them have happened in Texas, but there's no process really for, if an illegal alien using the social security number and identification of John Smith in Minnesota to get a job goes through E-Verify, and then someone using the exact same information, social security number in California, there's no real legal process for the IRS to put two and two together and say, well, yeah, this is obviously an illegal alien. And unfortunately, that requires some action from Congress to fix. And this Illegal Aliens Cop Act, I think, is a step in the direction of Congress trying to fix some of these loopholes. All right, let's see. We have any more questions come in? From Darren Miller. If Iran does fall, what are the chances they tell
the cells?
Yeah, they tell the Iran-linked cells here to activate?
Yeah, I think that's. I won't rule out the possibility of like a dead man switch or something like that. Something akin to it, but I really think you have to think about what would be the goal there aside from just causing chaos, which would likely be crushed quickly because they would be foreign terrorists at that point. Foreign terrorists with no head. You're going to need somebody you're going to need a state-backed sponsor, and if they don't have a state-backed sponsor, well, what's the point of the mission? So basically, I don't think they would. Or if they did, it would be relatively ineffective.
Yeah, this goes back to the Sarah Adams thing, that we talked about over like the last year, I think, when she first put it out in December 2024. There are, just because of how expansive the United States is, how porous the border was during the Biden administration, yeah, there probably are it is not impossible that there are foreign terrorist actors and cells here in the United States. And in the Iran case, I mean, there has been activity in the past, like Iran and Hezbollah have conducted actions here in the past, including with cooperation of criminal organizations like biker gangs, as one example. All right. We'll give you guys a couple more seconds to get some questions in.
There are a few other ones that
from Bad Wabbit, did you cover Ukraine blowing up the Zuzba pipeline supplying Hungary and Slovakia?
We did not, for the most part. If it's Ukraine war related, every time it seems like they have crossed a line, nothing really comes of it. There were what was it, right outside of Moscow, there were a few places hit a couple of years ago. Russia has saber rattled plenty of times about nuclear weapons and never touched one off. They're constantly discussing the possibility of talking about peace. To me, it looks like the entire war is kind of at a standstill, and no matter what either side does, they're not really moving the line or increasing aggression. It's been kind of stuck for a couple of years now.
All right.
And there was
question.
One thing I wanted to address. This is what happens if Iran sinks a carrier. I think that this is actually an outdated mode of analysis, and I just when you look at the Red Sea, that was actually for anybody who's been around for a long time, that was my big concern was, oh my God, they're actually going to reach out and touch one of the ships and it's going to not go well. It's going to, completely undermine the U.S. maritime dominance. That never happened. Frankly, it never happened. And despite the fact that I was part of anti-ship missile defense for 10 years in the U.S. Navy, I thought for sure, yeah, one or two of them are going to get through. Nothing happened, and the SWO boss, the surface warfare boss, came out and said, "Yeah, not only did we manage to sink shoot down every single missile, we did it more efficiently than we ever projected." I don't think Iran's going to be able to touch a carrier, quite frankly. Despite my experience, I was so thoroughly impressed with how the U.S. Navy did in the Red Sea. I don't think that Iran can do it. And when you look at the forces that are assembled there, they're not going to touch one of the carriers. They may touch one of the destroyers, but the last time they did that, the U.S. Navy just destroyed the Iranian fleet. That was Operation Praying Mantis, and that technology gap has only gotten wider.
All right. Then I did see one question from Vitlaus over on YouTube. Does information at some point make you feel impotent? Well,
I asked him about that. He said he didn't want that answered.
Okay.
It was just
Well,
rhetorical.
I think that's actually an important point. Is that there can be a paralysis by analysis, right? Especially for your average person, average American who's being bombarded constantly with the news and information, and which we try to filter to find the most important information analysis for you guys. But one of the things you can do with this information to not feel impotent, not to not have paralysis by analysis, is basically focusing on the local level, getting involved in local politics. Like, one of the things you can do is look for local organizations that are organizing around local politics that align with your own politics. You look for groups that are trying to run candidates in county board elections, city council elections. Go talk to your city councilmen, because that is where you're going to have the most impact. Honestly, is at the local level, and that includes because there's this one of the things I'm a big proponent of is the patronage model for politics. And in order to have a patron, you have to be a client. One of the ways you become a client is by getting involved, talking to your local politicians, politics is people, it's relationships. And you want to develop those relationships so you can have an impact at the local level. Because most people aren't really going to have a huge impact individually at the national level politics. But you can go to your city council and go to your city council meetings and have some input into, for example, your local city council trying to vote to stop, if you're pro immigration enforcement, stop them from banning ICE from using local properties. And that's where you can have a lot more impact and avoid feeling impotent with an overload of information. All right. Well, if that is we have one more from Frozen Nomad. Given the major nuclear research sites have already been struck in Iran, are there any ways a limited strike now can further hurt their nuclear ambitions?
Yeah, Rubio alluded to some of that during his comments yesterday. Basically, they are trying to rebuild. Iran has not gotten back to the enrichment stage yet, but they're trying to rebuild those, and those would likely be hit. You could also hit anybody that's really associated to those. So if there's a construction company that is basically just contracted for this, well, okay, you're fair game too. We keep telling you no. That's it. I think the most important effect to keep in mind is that the more the U.S. strikes Iran with impunity. Keep in mind that what we did that in Midnight Hammer. We got in, took no losses, annihilated the program, came back out. That's a major blow to the Iranian regime's legitimacy internally. You can't defend your own country. That is the more important effect, is if the U.S. continues to strike, how legitimate does the Iranian regime seem to the Iranian people?
All right. I see a comment from X-Runner55. Find organizations outside the mainstream GOP. Sort of. But I think you don't want to. This is all based on your local context. You don't want to completely eschew your local GOP. Actually, what you should be doing is going to your local GOP meetings and gaining influence there, because a lot of these local Republican Party groups, they have empty seats. They don't have a lot of attendance, and they are open to, if you have an organized group of people who want to impact local politics, they are ripe for takeover, frankly, to go to these things like your local young Republican groups, your local Republican Party meetings, and start building influence there. Because it's very difficult for a third party, or for lack of a better way to describe it, an insurgent political movement to gain influence in our system. One of the things you can do is co-opt an already existing political infrastructure, your local Republican parties. So that's one of the things you should be doing if you really want to influence your local political situation, is going to GOP meetings, local GOP meetings, taking over your local young Republicans. And I also, from Vitlaus, I guess this is in response to answering his rhetorical question, a positive note. Yeah, that's part of our project here isn't just to bombard you with information. It's one, to give you information that is useful for you, and two, to give you information that is useful for you and promote you getting involved in organizing at your local level, because that's really what's going to be important in the future, is having a local organization, having a local network, not just relying on national level organizations that you have no input into. All right, let's see, did we have any more questions come in? From Cephalopod. What about the weapons China dropped off in Iran several weeks ago?
Yeah, I'm talking to him about that in the chat. Uh, there were Chinese military planes that showed up, but there hasn't been any discussion about what they actually did drop off. It doesn't necessarily have to be weapons. That said, a lot of Iran's weapons, we covered this yesterday, they openly use Chinese missiles, and Iran has been, at least as we're told, Iran has been supplying the Houthis, who the U.S. went toe to toe with who the U.S. went toe to toe against in the Red Sea for about 2 years. So effectively, what you got there was the U.S. testing itself against Iranian missiles, or at least missile technology in another person's hands. And I don't even know how many missiles they totally shot down. I think it was in the hundreds, and lost 0 people except for the one aircraft that we shot down. So the only American casualties were friendly fire. There was one here. This was
So
we
from
forgot a queue.
Pro My TV, what is being done to improve our trust in elections? I think most of us worry the left will steal the next election. Well, there's still the Trump administration is still fighting in the courts over getting access to these state voter rolls. I think the Trump administration is aware of this distrust in elections, especially from Republicans. This is something, we've been talking about this for a couple years. There is a risk that every election, the losing side loses more trust in elections, and we start to see more of this breakdown. And this started in the middle of the Biden administration, after the 2020 election, and going into the midterms in 2022 and headed into the 2024 election. Public opinion polling showed that it's bipartisan. Both sides are losing more trust in elections, and that is the vibe shift on that can turn into real world problems. In this case, the perception of illegitimacy of elections increases. I think the Trump administration is aware of that, and they're also aware of how a handful of votes in a couple of districts in certain key states can completely swing elections. So they're still fighting on that. There's still pressure going on to pass the Save America Act as well, but as far as I can see, there's not been any movement on it. Senate Majority Leader John Thune is now saying that he's not even going to hold a vote on it until the DHS shutdown ends. So I don't expect a vote on that for a while, because Democrats are not backing down, and the nuclear option of eliminating the filibuster and getting DHS funding passed with a simple majority, and then getting the Save America Act passed with a simple majority is also just not something that Thune is interested in either. But I believe the Trump administration is aware of this problem, and I just don't see a solution in the short term right now. All right. And then from Bad Wabbit, if France and UK give nukes to Ukraine, what's stopping Russia from giving nukes to Iran?
Going basically this destabilization issue that we've been talking about. Hey, what happens if Iran does fall? Well, now those nukes that Russia would have just given to Iran are in who knows whose hands. Also, there is the issue of targeting. You do need to actually have the ability to use the nuclear weapons. Simply having them is not enough. Both of the potential recipients named here, Ukraine and Iran, likely lack the ability to use them unless it's just in a straight up ballistic missile fashion, and that's not useful. Frankly, I think this is not remotely likely to happen on either side. Just I don't think it is. I don't see why. There could be some movement after the Ukraine war where maybe proliferation is allowed, but just because they used to be a nuclear state. But at the same time, I don't think anybody's going to just start handing out nukes like that. That's a good way to get a nuclear war going. We almost saw that with Pakistan and India. That's basically the byproduct of somebody handing out nukes.
All right. Well, so with that, we are going to end the show for today. We'll be back with you in your inbox and on the show at 08 Central. Have a good rest of your day and stay out front.